In this video, you will learn the rules for addition. Now I'm going to show you two different explanations on the different rules for addition. The first set of explanations is going to be the more formal explanation of the concepts. And then after we'll do a different explanation where we just kind of break it down into simpler terms. So here, the rules for addition. We begin with if A and B are both positive. So if the two numbers are positive, what you do is you simply add the absolute values of those numbers together. So for example, if you had 4 plus 6, you just take the 4 and the 6, add them together to get 10. Alright, so that's the most basic of examples. Now what if A and B are both negative? Well, it's really the same thing. We're going to add the absolute values of A and B together, but then the sign is going to be negative. So for example, we have negative 5 plus negative 3. They're both negative, so we take the absolute values of the two numbers. So we take the 5 and the 3, add them together to get 8, and then the sign is going to be negative. So it's a negative 8. Alright, if A is positive and B is negative, and in this case A has the greater absolute value, then what I do is I simply subtract the two absolute values from each other. So for example, we have 5 plus negative 3. So the absolute value of 5 is bigger than the absolute value of negative 3, because 5 is bigger than 3. So when I subtract, I just simply subtract 5 minus 3, and that gives me 2. Alright, if A is positive and B is negative, and B has the greater absolute value, then I subtract the B from or by A, so B minus A, the absolute values, subtract them, and the sign is going to be negative. So for example, we have 5 plus negative 11. So the second number is bigger than the first number, the absolute value. 11 is bigger than 5. So what I do is I subtract 11 minus 5, which is 6, and the sign is going to be negative. So my answer would be a negative 6. And then lastly, if A and B are opposites, then you add them together, and that will equal 0. So for example, 4 and negative 4 are opposites. If you add them together, my answer is going to be 0. So this is the formal explanation of the rules for addition. Now I will explain in a different manner, which may be a little easier to understand. Alright, so bottom line, if the signs are the same, then I simply add the absolute values and keep the sign. So for example, the 4 plus 6 equals 10. I just add the absolute values and keep the sign. They're both positive, so my answer is positive. Here we have negative 4 plus negative 6. The signs are the same. In this case, they're both negative. And when I add them, I add the 4 and 6 to get 10, and I keep the sign, which was negative. So my answer would be a negative 10. If the signs are different, I subtract the two numbers. So I subtract the smaller number from the bigger number. And then the sign is determined by looking at the number with the greater absolute value. So for example, if you had negative 4 plus 6, the signs are different. We have a negative 4 and a positive 6. So when I add them together, I subtract 6 by 4, so 6 minus 4, which equals 2. And then to determine if it's positive or negative, I look at the 6 and 4 and see which one is bigger. Well, 6 is bigger than 4, and the sign with 6 is positive, so my answer would be a positive 2. Here we have 4 plus negative 6. So the signs are different. We have a positive 4 and a negative 6. So here, because the signs are different, I take the 6 and the 4, and I subtract the two numbers. So 6 minus 4 is 2. Now to determine the sign, if it's positive 2 or negative 2, I look at the 4 and the 6, and see which one has a bigger absolute value. Well, 6 is bigger than 4, so 6, I would look at the sign with the 6, and that would be the sign of my answer. So the 6 was negative, so my answer would be a negative 2. Alright, here is example 1 where we can practice what we just learned. We see we have 5 plus negative 4 plus 13 plus negative 10. Now there's different ways you can do this. You could add and subtract in any order, really. If we wanted to, we could begin by adding the first two together. So 5 plus negative 4. Well, the signs are different, which means I subtract 5 minus 4, which would be 1. And then to determine positive or negative, I look at the absolute values. So 5 is bigger than 4, so I keep the sign of the 5, which was positive, so that would be a positive 1. So I now have 1 plus 13 plus negative 10. Well, 1 plus 13 is 14, and then 14 plus negative 10, the signs are different. One's positive, one's negative, so I subtract 14 minus 10 to get 4, and the 14 is bigger and is positive, so my answer is a positive 4. Method 2, we could, if we wanted, look at the positive numbers and add those together, and then look at the negative numbers and add those together, and then combine at the end. If we do it this way, we would have the 5 plus 13, those are the two positive numbers, and that would give me 18. And then adding the negative numbers, we have negative 4 plus negative 10, and when we add those together, that would be a negative 14. The signs are the same, so I add the 4 and the 10 to get 14, and then I keep the sign, which was negative. So I have 18 and negative 14, and then I can finish by adding those together. So 18 plus negative 14 is the same thing as 18 minus 14, which would be 4. So my answer is 4. Example 2. We have negative 282 plus 374 plus 182 plus a negative 531. For this problem, I'm going to do that method 2 that we did for example 1, where we add the positive numbers together and then add the negative numbers together and then combine at the end. So looking at the positive numbers, we have 374 and we have 182. If we add those together, we would get 556. Okay, then we add the negative numbers. So we had the negative 282 and we have a negative 531. We can add those together and we would get negative 813. So now to finish off, we add those two numbers together. So negative 813 with 556. If I add those together, the signs are different, which means I actually subtract 813 minus 556, which is 257. And then I keep the sign of the bigger number, which was the 813. And so that was negative, and my final answer would be a negative 257.